Welcome back to Mi Vaya Mi Vida. I am Juan Carmona.
And I am Mariana Luna, and we are your hosts. So today we're going to be talking about LGBTQ in the Valley for Pride Month, in honor of Pride Month. And before we get any further, I just want to apologize for how I sound. I sound a little bit nasally. It's because I'm still getting over a cold that I had all of last week. So I sound a little bit weird, and this is also not the same format we usually use, but we wanted to get this episode out in honor of Pride Month. So we all know, or most of us know, that Pride Month started with the Stonewall riots that happened June 28th, 1969 in Greenwich Village in the neighborhood of Lower Manhattan in New York City, New York. It was in protest of police brutality against the LGBTQ community. And you have very famous figures that come out of New York, such as Martha P. Johnson, very famous Black trans woman. So we have a lot of that history. It's nationwide, starts up like the real spark of a nationwide movement, because similar demonstrations like Stonewall had happened in the United States before, but Stonewall was really the one to kind of bring everyone together and really recognize the LGBTQ community and their presence and their contributions to American society and throughout history. So we wanted to do something that honored both the LGBTQ community, but also sticking to what we really know and going over the history of the RGV. So we wanted to do a whole episode on LGBTQ history in the RGV. And Juan, do you want to tell us a little bit about our guests that we interviewed for this episode?
Yes, you're going to hear from two directors that are working on a documentary on the history of LGBTQ in the Valley. Their names are Ronnie Garza and Gabriel Sanchez. And Gabriel, the first time I met him was at he was giving a talk about history in the Valley and about specifically LGBTQ history. And me being a historian, I was just eating up all this new information. So with no further ado, I'm going to have them introduce themselves and let's get this episode started.
Hello, everyone. Gabriel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, totally. Hi, my name is Gabriel Sanchez. My pronouns are they, she, and he. I'm a native of the Rio Grande Valley. I grew up in Stark County and Hidalgo County. I'm involved in a few different projects that work to advocate for, uplift, and support the LGBT community, LGBTQ plus community here in the Rio Grande Valley. And I am also a historian and researcher documenting the history of the queer and trans community in the Rio Grande Valley. And I am co-directing with Ronnie Garza a upcoming documentary on the history of the Valley's LGBTQIA plus community.
Ronnie, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
For sure. My name is Ronnie Garza, and I'm a filmmaker and kind of border historian, and just sort of like interested in the region in general. The first documentary that worked on it's called As I Walk Through the Valley, and that documented some of the musical history of the region, kind of a chunk of time, kind of similar to the way that we're approaching Pansy, with about maybe 40 or 50 years worth of kind of local history, kind of told about like a certain community within the region. And then I'm also working on a broader history project called 11,000 Years of History in the Rio Grande Valley, which is more of a survey of the general history of the region that goes back to kind of indigenous history as well, up to the present.
Okay, Gabriel, the first time I met you, you're giving like a really great early history of LGBTQ in South Texas. And so could you give me a little rundown of that early history up until maybe as close to the present, just a quick rundown?
Yeah, so I'll give a quick kind of overview of Valley LGBTQ plus history. Obviously, this is like probably the topic I'm the most passionate about in the world, so I could talk about it forever, but I'll try my best to do like a quick summary. But yeah, I love asking people when I've done presentations in the past on Valley LGBTQ plus history, how far back they think our presence, is documented in the Valley. And the truth is that we've always existed. A lot of different Native American ethnicities and cultures, not only accepted, but often celebrated people we would today consider LGBTQIA plus. A lot of indigenous cultures had different terminologies and recognized third, fourth, and sometimes even fifth genders, depending on their culture. And so gender diversity and sexual diversity were something that were very common in the Americas before colonization. And that's not any different in this region. So there are documented instances in northeastern Mexico and in South Texas of people who we would today consider potentially non-binary or transgender or queer. And then later ethnic groups that came into indigenous ethnic groups that came into the region, because the Valley has a really interesting history when it comes to the different indigenous groups that were important or are important to the area, also had documented traditions of gender diversity and sexual diversity. So we've always existed, but a lot of that unfortunately was not necessarily lost with colonization. I don't like to say lost, but in some communities it was suppressed or forgotten. But we, as far as the modern community, you really start to see it take shape. There was a few bars in Reynosa in the 1940s that had drag shows. Fortunately, we'll probably never know about the lives of the people that performed in those drag shows. Some of them performed to straight audiences. But on this side of the border, we really start to see like a modern LGBTQ plus community take shape in the 1950s and 1960s. It was mostly just queer and trans kids finding each other. A lot of times they were just becoming more, for whatever reason, maybe mirroring trends that were happening nationwide. There were more queer and trans children who were just coming out and being visible and finding each other and building community where they could, whether that was in a public park or under the bleachers at a football game. But we see a lot of these kids kind of forming small communities in their schools, and they were often tortured and bullied and discriminated against, but they continue to find each other. And you see a lot of public spaces kind of being claimed by the queer community. So Archer Park is a really common one. The McAllen Nature Center is another one. And we have some great pictures of queer people kind of hanging out in the monte, for lack of a better word, because there were no other spaces for them. In the early 70s, you start to see more gay bars opening. There were actually quite a few, even going back into the 1970s. There was Duffy's, later Bumpers, and the et cetera, et cetera. And each time a new club opens, some were very short-lived, but the more these clubs were opening, the more you saw the growth of a very visible, more organized community. A lot of that had to do with drag and drag performers. You started to see the growth of a really vibrant, really active drag community in the Valley. And that often gave people not just a space to perform, but a space to belong. You saw the creation of drag families that kind of took the place of biological families of origin that rejected people. And you really see that grow into the early 80s. Then when the AIDS crisis hits in the mid to late 80s in the Valley, it really changes the face of the community in a lot of ways. You start to see a lot more what we would think of as activism, right? A lot of community support groups that form, a lot of efforts both in and out of the club scene to support people who are living with or dying of AIDS-related complications. In the late 90s, early 2000s, you start to see a lot of student activism, a lot of students kind of like being more bold and more visible about claiming space and forcing Valley schools to accommodate them. And you see a lot of really bold student activism. You also see the growth of a really visible trans community in the 90s. The trans community had always been a part of the larger LGBT community. But unfortunately with that, you also see kind of a wave of violence targeting that community in the 1990s. And that's something that we look at in the documentary. And then in the present, you see, there's been, I think in the last few years, a real growth in terms of the organization of the community and the visibility of the community. But we owe, everything we're able to do now to those people who had the courage to be visible and authentic and to live as themselves when that carried so many risks. And so I think there is a through line between what's going on now and what took place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Thank you so much for that quick rundown. I know it's a lot, like as a historian, I could talk forever on any subject because I got to go all the way back to this day. Let me move over to Ronnie. Can you tell us a little bit about, what the film's called and the inception and the idea where you got, why you got started on that topic?
Me and my co-director for the last documentary, me and Charlie Vela, we were screening As I Walk Through the Valley, and at that time, Gabriel was starting to write about some of the research that they were just talking about right now, in a local publication. So I saw these stories, and I saw some images, some of the pictures, and thought that it would make a really interesting follow-up to the music doc. Again, kind of a similar time frame. It sort of looked like is what from the photos, it seemed like 90s to 80s, and probably could stretch further back. So we approached Gabriel, and just kind of took it from there. It's been a really wonderful experience, and I've learned so much about this history that I was unfamiliar with, and met so many of the people who kind of built that community. So it's been a really wonderful, I think, overall kind of filmmaking experience. Really excited for what it's starting to look like in terms of the stories that are coming together, and what the picture's starting to look like. And I'm very like, I want people to see it. I'm very interested in people checking out the new movie. So hopefully we'll be done soon. We keep on saying kind of soon, but we want to make sure to take care and tell these stories, with all the sort of importance that they sort of deserve and stuff like that. So we just want to make sure it's as best as it could be, and it'll be available soon. I'm very excited for people to see it. So in general, that's kind of been my takeaway from the thing, and like I said, I learned a lot. I can talk about various different aspects of the film, but in general, it's been great, kind of just being able to hear these stories, and to try to convey them, to sort of give a voice to this community.
Could you say the title of the film, just so people know what to look for when it does?
Yeah. So the title of the film comes from the first Pride event that we that I think that's actually what Gabriel was writing about the first time that I sort of learned about the research and stuff. But Pansy Pachanga is the name of the film, and it gets its name from the kind of culminating event at the first Pride, and which was called the Pansy Pachanga. So just seemed like a great title, and and kind of just a callback.
Yeah. And alliteration's great, and it's very valley because it's like a Spanish word and an English word, and they're both kind of archaic, so it's like, how much more valley can you get?
Yeah. Ariana, do you have any question or two?
Yeah, I do actually. So I follow the social media for Pansy Pachanga, and also I believe yours, Ronnie's, also 11,000 years in history. So I follow both of those. And I love the post. Like I'm also a history nerd, so it's like whatever, right? It's what I do on a daily basis. But actually, I wanted to know if ever since launching your social media presence for Pansy Pachanga, and also your account, Ronnie, have people come to you to add any of their own experiences of the LGBTQ community here in the Valley that you previously didn't know about? And are you going to add some of that experience in the film?
Yeah, so definitely. I think when we first started, there was, I think the Instagram for Pansy Pachanga especially has kind of taken on like a life of its own, like, because it has, there's just like a lot of history that's documented on there that's obviously not all going to fit in the movie. And so it's a really good opportunity to share some of these like really inspiring or interesting stories that come from this really rich community here. But yeah, definitely, there have been people that we found out about through the social media, especially in the initial stages, people that reached out to us, and then we were like, we should try to work this story in. And there was a lot more that we found out as we started, so we went in with a pretty clear idea of a lot of the history that I'd been researching beforehand. But in the process of filming, we've discovered a lot more too. And yeah, there's people that have reached out to with just like really cool pictures that have made their way into the documentary. Some of my favorite pictures were just people on the Instagram being like, here it is. And they didn't necessarily want to be interviewed, But they had this really cool picture from like the evolution in the 1970s or 10th Avenue in the early 90s. I remember somebody sent me a picture from a drag competition in 1976 at a bar called Toys that I didn't even know existed. It was so short-lived. So yeah, definitely. And there's also kind of like a little community that forms around the social media. Like the diehard followers, and it's really great to see. And some people who like share their own experiences with some of the venues that we talk about, or their memories of seeing some of the drag queens that we talk about. There's a drag queen I've shared a lot about named Keisha Ross. And I met her when I was a kid, and just seeing her be so authentically herself was like a huge impact for me as a person. And I really wanted to go back and document her story. And I found out she'd passed away. And just seeing people's memories of her or other people who were killed, or taken from us too young.
Ronnie, is there anything you want to add to that?
Not much. I mean, definitely check out those Instagrams at Pansy Pachanga and at RGV History. Some folks have approached me with some kind of like tidbits here and there, but I do feel like that project is still a little bit on the new side, and so I haven't put out everything yet, and so that one's still kind of like developing. But definitely every once in a while people reach out with interesting detail here and there. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I want to say, like, when we ran the series related to Jillian's film, some of the crypto Jewish history, when we did some of those posts, some people reached out with some like things to look at, some names and some other people to kind of like consider as to some other crypto Jews that were of interest in this region and stuff like that. So definitely every once in a while people reach out.
I will say, when you screen pieces of it, it knocks Tejas Foco, what was it, like right before the pandemic? I was like, I think that was the last event anyone attended, then there was the big pandemic. For those who don't know, that's National Association of Chicano Scholars, Tejas Foco, which is like the Texas region. And it happened to be in McAllen. I think it was like the year right before everything shut down, right before spring break. And right. I know there were students there, and they were so into the clips you were playing. And so like you definitely sparked a lot of interest in them. They were like, we can't wait to see more of this. They really enjoyed the clips that you showed, in your presentation. So I will say you have, people eager to see more. One question I do want to ask, because as a historian, that's the thing I love. Is there something that you found like just blew your mind that you had no idea, a story like, I thought I knew this, but no idea about this?
I think there's been quite a few. I'm trying to think. I mean, I just think that like the amount of people who are willing to live, authentically and visibly as themselves without fear, or maybe they had fear, but they kind of like pushed through that fear at a time when being an out queer person or an out trans person carried so many more social consequences is constantly inspiring. But there are a lot of, facts that kind of like just blew my mind. So even something I found out fairly recently. So there's two things that come to mind, Ronnie, that I can share. And then if you want to add anything, but so one of the people we interviewed, and it's an amazing interview, and Ronnie and Charlie actually interviewed her for the last documentary, is Angela Garza, who is a very like important figure in the local punk music scene, and she plays in a band called Angela and the X's and in several other bands, and she was inspiring to a lot of like queer women who came of age in the 90s and 2000s, and she actually had a queer uncle who was died of in 1975 and under kind of like of a really quick illness that came on suddenly and no one really knows what it was, and she has these great pictures of him and his friends just kind of like hanging out in the monte. And to see like those early documentations was something I didn't think we'd be able to find, from like the very early 70s before there were even gay bars in the Valley. And recently, when I did a presentation at the library with Jillian Glantz, who Ronnie mentioned, I showed one of the pictures, and two women came up afterwards to say, and I always say, a lot of this history is just coming from oral history, which is really beautiful, but it can be really contradictory, and it takes a lot of work to kind of piece it all together. So I'm probably saying something that, someone might correct me later. And they came up to me and they said, my brother and my cousin weren't in there, and they weren't gay to our knowledge, but they were migrants. And they did tell us a story about going to a drag show at a migrant camp, that there were a bunch of Valley folks in the early 70s or late 60s, that there were a bunch of Valley folks who were at a migrant camp somewhere up north, and that there was a drag show that went on, but the women weren't allowed to attend, only the men. So how that picture ended up in the hands of this man who died in 1975, who did drag, it's a really fascinating thing. And we've interviewed a lot of people who are queer and trans and also migrants. One of the first interviews I ever did was of my gay uncle, who was a migrant who grew up in Rio Grande City and Donna in the 1960s. He informed a lot of the work I did later. And then something else that really blew my mind is I have another uncle who I talk about all the time, probably too much, but when I do these interviews, but he was murdered in 1992, and I grew up just knowing that he was gay and that he'd been murdered. I didn't know about this like rich life he lived. And in the process of doing this research, I found out that he played a huge role in really cultivating the local drag scene, that he helped plan the first Pride, that the kickoff event was actually at one of his bars, that he was the first queer person to own a queer bar in the Valley, and that he lived this like rich, amazing life that his family didn't really know about. And so that's also been on a personal level, really, really beautiful.
The one thing that always sticks out to me when I kind of think back on the interviews is that we got to meet a close personal friend of Gloria Anzaldúa. We got to hang out with Randy Connor for a few hours and interview him. And it was really like an honor just to have that conversation. He was so smart. And I liked some of the insights that he gave us into kind of Gloria's character and stuff like that. I felt like I felt like she felt a lot more familiar after we talked with him. It seemed like kind of a nerdy sci-fi geek kind of person that I would have gone to high school with, or like new growing up or something like that. So that was really, really nice. I don't know. I mean, just so many of these really amazing stories. I don't know. I mean, it's just like there's so many really cool stories that we got to kind of uncover. So it's hard to kind of pick one or others, but like the Gloria stuff definitely stands out to me.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing, your stories and your project. I'll definitely, when we post this up, we'll put links to the hashtag for Instagram and your any other links or whatever. You can email me or message me just to make sure I can connect them all, so we can share the broader history, follow the Instagram and stuff like that, and then so people who are interested in the film can also know more when it, as it progresses. Is there anything you guys want to add before we go ahead and end this interview?
Well, I would say, also check out As I Walk Through the Valley if you haven't seen it already. The musical history of the region, kind of like the rock music, the birth of punk, and stuff like that. So it's very proud of that, and it also tells part of the history of the place as well.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. I love that documentary as well.
Me too. And yeah, I just wanted to add, it's Pride Month. It's important to celebrate. It is a celebration, but it's more than just a party. It's more than just like buying rainbow things, although I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think we as a community have earned the right to celebrate ourselves and to just celebrate in general because we've survived so much. But it's also an opportunity to reflect on exactly what it is we're celebrating. And we're celebrating a lot of the resilience and the creativity and the endurance and just like the strength that our community has had to embody just to survive. And I think that is something that's really important to remember, especially now, because we're still under attack, unfortunately, in the state of Texas by lawmakers, by violence, by people targeting trans children. And so I think what I hope this documentary does is it gives people an idea of how much we have to be proud of, just how many of these stories of just these really incredible people in the Rio Grande Valley there are. One plug, I'll be doing I've done it in previous years, an exhibit on LGBTQ plus history at the island for the Valley's Pride this year on June 25th. I don't know if this will be out in time, but
right. But thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge and just sharing your stories.
Okay, and wrapping things up, is there anything else you want to add, Adriana?
Yeah, so just to enjoy the podcast, listen, and keep an eye out for the documentary that they were talking about at Pansy Pachanga on Instagram and Facebook. We'll link all their socials so you can keep up with that. We'll link Ronnie's socials also for all the other work he's also done. and continue to support LGBTQ youth and people here in the Valley. Give them support. They are human too, and they have existed in history for a long time, as you can hear in the interview. And that's what we wanted to just highlight in this episode.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Ariana said. Support them. And try to attend maybe some of the Pride events that are happening throughout the Valley. And hopefully we'll see this documentary soon. Look out for Pansy Pachanga. Like I mentioned in the interview, we were at a conference, saw some clips, and everyone really enjoyed it and wanted to hear more of that history. And it's part of the history of the world, it's part of the history of the Valley. And it's something that we always want to highlight, the history of the world and the Valley, because the Valley is always interconnected worldwide. So until next time, we love you,
Love
RGV.
you, RGV.